In 1872, a British museum scholar named George Smith was translating a broken clay tablet from Nineveh when he found a sentence that made him strip off his clothes in excitement right there in the reading room. He had just found a flood story 1,000 years older than the Bible's, and it was almost identical. The tablet was fragment 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and what Smith was reading was not a footnote to Genesis. It was a complete, self-contained flood narrative carved into clay centuries before Genesis existed in any form we would recognize. A god warns one man. The man builds a vessel. He loads it with his family and the seed of every living thing. The waters rise and cover the earth. When they recede, he releases a bird to search for land. The flood story is the one that keeps insisting on being found, in fragments, across cultures, no matter how thoroughly time tries to erase it. The standard explanation for two similar flood stories sitting a few hundred miles apart is easy. Mesopotamia and the Levant traded, fought, and occupied each other's territory for 2,000 years. Of course their stories overlap. That's not a mystery. That's geography. Two neighbors with a shared river system and centuries of contact are always going to end up with overlapping folklore, in the same way two neighboring towns end up with overlapping slang. Nobody needs a stranger explanation than proximity for that one. The problem starts when you leave the neighborhood, when you cross an ocean, a mountain range, or several thousand years, and find the same skeleton of a story standing there anyway, dressed in completely unrelated clothes. The Sumerian record. The oldest known version isn't even the one Smith found. It's older still, preserved in fragments of the Sumerian king list and the Eridu Genesis, where a king named Ziusudra is warned by the god Enki, who technically isn't allowed to warn him, so he speaks the warning to a wall instead, letting Ziusudra overhear it from the other side. It's a technicality dressed up as piety, the kind of detail that doesn't usually survive unless someone found it memorable enough to keep repeating. The Atrahasis epic, composed centuries later, tells essentially the same story with a different hero and a different, oddly bureaucratic motive. The gods send the flood not out of moral judgment, but because humanity has grown too loud and it's disturbing their sleep. In Gilgamesh, the survivor is named Utnapishtim, and the sequence Smith uncovered is oddly procedural for something so catastrophic. 3 birds, released in order. A dove, which finds nothing and returns. A swallow, which also returns. A raven, which does not come back, which is how Utnapishtim knows the water has finally receded enough to reveal land. For his survival, the gods grant him immortality, an ending none of the later versions bother to keep. 3 versions, 1 region, 1 obvious explanation. Shared culture, shared river system, shared vulnerability to catastrophic flooding along the Tigris and Euphrates. Nobody needs to reach for anything stranger than geography to explain Mesopotamia agreeing with itself. The Genesis account. Here is where mainstream scholarship still has a straightforward answer, and it's worth stating plainly before complicating it. The documentary hypothesis, developed over more than a century of textual analysis, identifies at least 2 separate narrative strands woven into the Genesis flood account, commonly labeled J and P, each with its own vocabulary, its own numbering of animals, its own chronology. Both strands almost certainly post-date Mesopotamian contact. The Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC put Hebrew scribes in direct, sustained contact with cuneiform flood literature, and the parallels go well past the broad strokes. Noah releases a raven, then a dove, in the same functional sequence Utnapishtim uses centuries earlier. Both arcs come to rest on a mountain in roughly the same general region. Both survivors offer a sacrifice immediately after landing, and in both stories, the god or gods respond to the smell of that sacrifice with something close to regret over how far the punishment went. This is not a case that needs an exotic explanation. It's a textbook case of cultural transmission, and most scholars treat it as settled. What's genuinely interesting is that the Genesis resembles Gilgamesh. It's what happens when you keep going east and west and south into regions where that transmission route doesn't exist. The Greek account. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, is warned by his father that Zeus intends to drown a corrupt humanity. He builds a chest, not a ship, just a wooden chest, and floats with his wife Pyrrha for 9 days until it lands on a mountain, sometimes named as Parnassus. Mainstream classicists have a reasonable answer here, too. Bronze Age Greece had extensive trade contact with the Near East, and Near Eastern flood motifs plausibly diffused west through Phoenician and Anatolian intermediaries over centuries. Diffusion is not an unreasonable explanation for a myth appearing in a trading partner's literature, but the detail that resists tidy diffusion is what Deucalion and Pyrrha do after they land. An oracle tells them to throw the bones of their mother behind them. They puzzle over it, then realize the mother is the earth and the bones are stones. They throw stones over their shoulders and the stones become people. Deucalions become men. Pyrrhas become women. That detail has no equivalent anywhere in the Mesopotamian versions. If the whole story diffused as a package, this piece would have had to be invented locally, seamlessly, and then treated as inseparable from the rest of the narrative. Either the Greeks borrowed a flood and independently invented a nearly identical restart mechanism, or the restart mechanism was never borrowed at all. The Aztec account, in the tradition recorded in the Codex Chimalpopoca as the legend of the five sons, the god Tezcatlipoca warns a couple, Tata and Nene, of a coming flood and tells them to hollow out a great cypress log and seal themselves inside with 2 ears of corn each. The waters rise and destroy the world. When Tata and Nene finally emerge, hungry, they catch and roast a fish, and the smoke angers the gods, who punish the couple by turning them into dogs. This is Mesoamerica, isolated from the Old World until 1519, with no plausible trade route, no shared river system, no shared language family, nothing. The standard academic explanation here isn't diffusion, it's independent invention. Flooding is a universal human catastrophe. Boats or sealed vessels are an obvious survival technology, and humanity restarting from a small surviving group is the only narratively satisfying way to explain why humans still exist after total destruction. That's a coherent argument. It's also an argument that has to independently explain why the vessel, the warning, the survivor restart structure, and even a bird or animal complication after the water recedes keep showing up as a package rather than showing up separately in different flood stories around the world. The Hindu account. In the Shatapatha Brahmana and later in the Puranas, a small fish approaches a man named Manu while he is washing his hands and asks him to protect it, promising in exchange to save him from a coming deluge. The fish grows enormous. Manu builds a boat, ties it to the fish's horn, and is towed to a mountain in the Himalayas as the flood rises. This tradition has real linguistic kinship to the Greek story. Both trace back through the Indo-European language family, and some comparative mythologists argue the flood and mountain framework may be an inherited Indo-European motif rather than an independent invention or a Near Eastern loan. That's a defensible academic position, and it deserves to be stated rather than waved away. But the fish is the detail that doesn't fit neatly into that explanation either. A talking, growing, guiding fish that pulls the survivor's vessel to safety is not part of the Mesopotamian or Greek versions, and yet functionally similar guide animal motifs. An animal that either warns of the flood or leads survivors to high ground turn up independently in traditions with no plausible Indo-European or Near Eastern connection at all. Later Puranic versions escalate the image further, describing the fish, eventually identified as an avatar of Vishnu, growing so large it fills the ocean, an addition that came centuries after the earliest telling, suggesting the story kept demanding to be made stranger rather than settling into a fixed form, which means the fish either traveled somewhere it has no business having traveled, or the idea of an animal messenger warning humanity of catastrophe is something separate cultures kept arriving at on their own. The Chinese account. Here is where the pattern should by rights break cleanly. Ancient Chinese tradition does have a great flood, recorded in texts like the Shu Jing, but it is structured almost nothing like the others on this list, and that difference matters more than another match would. There is no ark. There is no single warned survivor. There is a magistrate named Gun, appointed by the emperor to stop a flood that has been drowning the land for what the texts describe as decades, who tries to hold the water back with dikes and dams. He fails repeatedly for so long that the emperor eventually has him executed for the failure. His son, Yu, inherits the same impossible task and solves it by doing the opposite of his father, not blocking the water but channeling it, dredging riverbeds and cutting new courses to guide the flood out to sea. Yu succeeds after after years of labor so consuming that later tradition claims he passed his own house 3 times without going in to see his family, and his success earns him the founding of the Jia dynasty, China's first. A flood myth about engineering, bureaucracy, and earned political legitimacy instead of divine warning and survival. If flood myths were simply diffusing outward from Mesopotamia, or if humanity's imagination only had one way to process a catastrophic flood, this is the version that shouldn't exist. It exists anyway, right alongside the others, which is the detail worth sitting with. The skeleton isn't as universal as it first appears. Somewhere between the neat convergence and the total outlier, the real shape of the pattern is hiding.